Hey everyone, Ariel Adams here with the Superlative Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Geoff Shester. He is the senior scientist and someone who's responsible for policy initiatives in California at Oceana. Geoff, welcome.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So a little bit of context for listeners. A few weeks ago now, I joined you and some of the Oceana team on what you call an expedition off the coast of California to the Channel Islands. I guess we could begin with that. What was the goal of this Oceana expedition?
Yeah, so this was a really exciting expedition for us. I've actually led several expeditions for Oceana in the past, and this was the first one out to the Channel Islands that focused a lot on more nearshore scuba diving research. So I can talk all about the different science that we did, but the broader goals are to really document the diversity and sensitive species that live off of the Channel Islands, off of California. Most people don't even realize how special of, kind of a Galapagos of North America we have just a few miles from the Los Angeles coast. And what we're really trying to do is raise awareness over some of the harmful fishing practices that are threatening this area, which is, I think, an extremely important policy issue for us, especially in light of climate change now starting to really affect some of these islands and our offshore areas in California.
So a little bit of context for those listening that may not have a lot of awareness of what goes on with, I'll just call it marine conservation as the larger category. Geoff is part of this organization, Oceana, whose goal is to tell the world, this is what's happening with our oceans, and here's what we think you should do about it. And part of that is collecting data to know what's happening in the oceans. Whether it is species that are going away or even sometimes new species coming in, there's changes of the life patterns in the oceans, and knowing that helps you understand what's going on. And so to make decisions about what to do in the water really begins with knowing what's happening in the waters. Let me ask you a question, Geoff. Why is it up to third-party organizations like Oceana to collect this data? Why don't governments do it? I know that they're obsessed about collecting data about what's going on in the air in terms of planes and stuff like that. Why aren't they as invested in knowing what's going on in the waters?
I think that a lot of governments, do invest in things like, counting fish populations. And, there are several things and ways the government does get involved. I mean, we have national marine sanctuaries and they have science teams. And so definitely don't want to belittle that. But I think that one of the important roles that Oceana plays is we're really trying to create policy change. Right. So we're trying to convince governments that the status quo and things that might be allowed now, some things may not actually be healthy or in the interest of broader society or the future of, a healthy, resilient ocean. So what we're trying to do is convince policymakers. And sometimes there's data that governments have and we bring that forward. But a lot of times we see that there's a gap there and we're able to actually fill that gap by bringing in some of the latest technologies, bring together scientists from different expertise and really use an interdisciplinary approach to help bring solutions forward and actually get lasting, meaningful policy change that then is implemented by governments either through laws or regulations.
So again, let me further clarify that, because again, I want the audience to be crystal clear on how all this stuff works. Because it can get murky, right? You can hear like ocean, sustainability, helping, laws, like it can get confusing. What I understood is that Oceana has two roles. As a science organization, you are there to use the scientific method to collect data appropriately and then come to as best a conclusion you can about it, like really just core scientific research. And then the other side of the organization is the advocacy arm, where you take those conclusions and you have a bunch of smart people like scientists and lawmakers and lawyers looking at it and saying, what do we do with this data? What can we learn in order to make suggestions on behavioral changes, policy changes, whatever, on how to use all this to promote the oceans being clean, having life in it, being there for us to use as a resource, whether it's for recreation or for food. Am I sort of detailing it correctly?
Yeah, I think, and a lot of times, there are silos, right? The people that are doing the science and gathering that information aren't necessarily the ones that are making the big decisions about human activities and what we're doing in terms of the oceans. And so I think Oceana plays a really important role of bridging that gap. And obviously, I think in order to have the credibility to go to decision makers, as a third party and say, we think you need to change your policy, we think you need to do things differently, we need to come forward with data and evidence to back up our advocacy position. And so that's really the purpose. And by doing that, it gives us a credibility, not just with policymakers, but with fishermen and other scientists, that we actually know what we're talking about and that our position is valid. And so we use the science, we combine that with the law, we go to the public, we do public communications and grassroots. All these different tools are all part of our toolbox to actually get meaningful, lasting policy change in the water.
One of the most important things about your organization, I imagine, is credibility. You need to be able to be credible not only to attract the right talent, but also so that your suggestions and your advice carry some weight. What are some of the main ways that Oceana has both created and continues to nurture the sense of credibility, which I imagine is so important to the crucial mission?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Our partnerships with the scientific community and our role in the scientific community is, I think, a really important part of that. So we're out there collecting our own data. We're out there analyzing data that other folks have gotten, attending conferences, and making sure that we actually know what we're talking about. And we're an on-the-water organization, right? We've been on fishing boats before. We're not just people that read about it on the internet and decide that we have a position, right? I personally got my PhD over at Hopkins Marine Station at Stanford University and worked with some of the world's leading experts in everything from how you study a kelp forest to how you track large animals that are migrating thousands of miles all over the ocean. And so I think, the credibility to bring that science forward, to have other scientists that are out there that will actually, stand up and validate our position, these are all kind of critical to the credibility that we have. And I think also just our track record. I mean, we've been out here working off of the California coast for over 20 years now. Oceana is now reaching 22 years old as an organization, and we have a demonstrated record. Not just with governments, but also with our supporters and large foundations, that we set goals to try to actually get meaningful, measurable things done, and we can actually show and have accountability for those goals. We make sure that they're objective. We try to go for 3 to 5 year campaigns. And, we've got, hundreds of victories that we can actually show how we got actually policies changed. And a lot of that was not things the government was going to do. A lot of those were proposals that Oceana created and solutions that Oceana helped work with other people to help develop and then brought to policymakers to get implemented.
So more than 2 decades of being in operation, I think that's also very telling. But also, just for further context, how big of an organization is Oceana? I understand it's an international organization. How big does it compare to others? And truly, how diverse is the breadth and the scope of what various other people in the organization do?
Yeah, I mean, it is really fantastic to work for such a diverse organization that is growing. We have approximately 250 employees based in 12 countries around the world now. We're continuing to expand. Our offices are primarily now in North and South America and Asia. We are looking to expand into other countries as well, and especially off of the continent of Africa. As these ocean problems are things that you find, the oceans are international inherently. And so we are the largest international ocean conservation organization out there that it's dedicated solely to ocean conservation. So there are other larger, non-governmental organizations that work on conservation, but Oceana is the largest that has protecting the oceans as our sole and our sole focus. And so the types of people that enter Oceana, I mean, we come from all different backgrounds and places. There's economists, policy wonks, lawyers, scientists like myself, biologists, communicators and writers. There's pretty much something for everyone. Folks that are getting to get into using new technologies. All of these people have found a place here, and I think that because we are such a diverse organization, with people not just from the United States, but we hire the experts, from the science community, from the political community in each of the countries that we work in. And I think that's really given us a lot of credibility as we have moved into the international sphere, and has made our organization as effective as it is.
I want to talk about Blancpain a little bit now. Blancpain is among several sponsors, and Blancpain has supported specific expeditions, such as the one in California that I joined you on. Talk a little bit about how Blancpain fits in to Oceana right now, and also importantly, how did you first get hooked up with them? Was it you? Was it someone else in the organization? I always just get curious about sort of the meeting stories between the watch company and the special organization like Oceana.
Yeah, it's a great and interesting story. I mean, Blancpain has been just a fantastic corporate sponsor and partner. We basically tend to find when we're partnering with corporations, we want to make sure, first of all, that there's not a conflict of interest and that there is a mutual interest. And I think the connection to diving, the history that Blancpain has with the diving community and advancing the technology, and it really is something that I think just fits beautifully with Oceana's mission, right? And I think the whole idea of exploration and discovery, the fact that we're still out there discovering new things about our ocean, discovering new places that no one even knew about before. I mean, that kind of gets to the heart of the partnership and Blancpain's commitment to the ocean globally. And so the partnership started with our corporate partnership team. I come in a little bit later as more of the scientist and expedition leader. But our team partnered up actually first on an expedition in Mexico, because as you're asking about the credibility, we opened our Mexico office just 6 years ago in Mexico City. And, one of the important first things that we try to do early on and when we have offices is do expeditions and actually get out there. And one of the great parts about it was, a lot of this happened during COVID, so there were challenges to overcome, but we were able to do an expedition at Bajos del Norte, which is a place in the Gulf of Mexico on the Mexican side, and really just discovered amazing things about reefs, that are out there, the connectivity of different species. We use this new technique that Oceana hadn't used before and partnered with some scientists using environmental DNA, where you're actually able to collect DNA that's just floating around in the water column and be able to identify the diversity of an area and a reef in a way that really is kind of unprecedented from a science perspective. And that science and exploration that we did really provided some novel results that resulted in one of the largest marine protected areas ever established in the country of Mexico. So the idea that we're not just partnering to do neat science, but we're actually using that to advance campaigns to protect areas permanently, that is really, I think, the heart of why the partnership has been so effective. And as Oceana started, and as I said, I've done a lot of expeditions for Oceana. They primarily in the past were done with remote operated vehicles, right? There was a bit of a tension with allowing Oceana staff to actually get in the water ourselves due to all the safety and insurance issues. And, over time, though, there's been a lot more pressure to really just get in the water and actually be doing some of that and take advantage of the ability to go scuba diving and doing research with scuba. And so I think Blancpain actually helped push Oceana to become more comfortable and get that, the capacity internally and the expertise to really be able to do successful scuba diving expeditions.
I want to talk about that sort of DNA sniffing technique. I got to witness part of that in the boat off of California, where you take a sample of water, you sort of push it through, I guess, a strainer. You get some gunk, which is, among other things, strands of DNA. And then it goes off to be analyzed in a lab. And I guess it compares it with a bunch of table of different, DNA that's in the system. And it gives you an idea of what life exists in that water. It's a fascinating technique. It has so much value. How new is this technique? I understand that it hasn't been around forever, definitely not 20 years ago, but how new is that technique?
Yeah, I mean, it's really kind of something that came on the scene, about a decade ago. People started using it. I started hearing about it at scientific conferences. It sort of seemed, honestly to me, like sort of one of these science fiction things, right?
Right.
What do you mean you can just like tell this huge story just from having a little bit of water? But it does really kind of, to me, what's fascinating about it is that there is an entire universe just in a small amount of seawater, right? There's an entire set of stories that can be told, and just like there can be kind of footprints out there that then you can kind of look at, and different ways you can tell different creatures have been in a certain place. The DNA really is this sort of ultimate, like sort of forensic tool that we're able to use to go back in time and see what animals have actually been in an area. And, the process of just, swimming around in the ocean, eating and doing all the regular bodily functions, it's amazing. Just, the ocean is just full of all this DNA. But the general problem is it's at such low concentrations, right? Like, you see like on, CSI, somebody like collects a little hair and can get the DNA from that. I mean, we're talking about, even, microscopic, particles that are out there in the water column just floating around. And the new technology is basically the ability to filter this water. So basically you just get a few liters of seawater. So think about those, like one of those bladders to hold your water when you're going camping or something, right? You bring one of those that's empty, you go to a certain depth, open it up, close it. You can put these down while you're diving. You can also put them down with Niskin bottles where you put, a container down at a very specific known depth. So we were putting these down like 300 feet to compare deep waters and shallow waters. And you can also collect on different places in the reef. And then what you do is you basically filter all of that. And as long as you essentially desiccate and dry out what you filter, the DNA actually stays, essentially fully intact. And you can transport it, move it to a lab. You literally can hold this thing in a Ziploc bag as long as it doesn't, get water back in it. And so you keep it dry, and then you run it through what they call a PCR, right? Polymerase chain reaction. And what that does is it magnifies this, right? So you have, you're literally talking about, individual molecules or fragments of DNA, and that this PCR technique allows you to amplify that and multiply it, thousands and thousands of times till all of a sudden you have something where you have it in a high enough concentration that you could run it through a sequencer. And then, at that point, it's basically you're just inundated with, all sorts of data, right? You've just got, every single base pair in an entire chain of DNA. And you can, essentially, it's kind of almost an endless set of things that you do. But what basically the tool is depending on what your question is with that DNA, you use a different primer. And a primer is basically something that, chops up and looks for a certain code or pattern in the DNA, right? And so depending on which primer you use, you can identify the presence of certain species, even individuals, right, within a certain species. So people are now looking at this to try to figure out, sharks and, which individual sharks might have been involved in a shark attack. And what we're doing it for is looking at kind of the more broad brush stroke of all of the different story of life and basically everything that's, a plant, an animal, or a fungus, right? We're looking at essentially a way to detect the presence of all the life that could be in the ocean, except for the bacteria and viruses. And so, being able to partner with some of the researchers like Adrian Munguia Vega, who was able to come out with us on the boat and actually show us these techniques and do the lab work, it enables us to really characterize the diversity of in these areas and add that to what the scuba divers are actually seeing and measuring themselves being in the water to tell a story of the biodiversity that's more comprehensive and complex than really anything that's been done before.
I want to add some context for a similar example that people may have heard of. I remember during the pandemic, people started hearing about how municipalities were testing the water in various cities to determine things like how much COVID-19 is in the population and what you could tell from just the sewage water about the diseases about the drugs people were taking, medicines, things like that, was an enormous. You could tell so much about a population by literally seeing their runoff water. This is a similar type of thing in the ocean, and it really has to do with the fact that at no moment can we really know what's going on down there. Signals don't go very well from the surface underwater. There aren't these, legions of robots swimming around monitoring things. If we're going to tell a government, hey, there's a problem, you can't allow them to hide behind the plausible deniability of, oh, no, nothing's wrong. How can you prove it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the biggest challenge in doing conservation in the ocean is exactly that. Like, there's so much uncertainty. There's so much we don't know. I mean, we know much more about, what the surface of Mars or the moon looks like than even what the ocean floor looks like a few miles away from the Los Angeles coastline. So I think just to be able to get a picture and actually see what's going on, I mean, even counting fish and knowing whether certain species of whales are in the area, these things are extremely difficult to know the answers to. And when you have destructive types of activities that could actually be harming the life that's there, it's really important to actually know what was there to begin with and be able to show there's a potential impact here and really be able to show that with data. And, a lot of times when there's a damaging type of fishing gear, right? No one is out there looking at what that gear is doing. Aside from the populations of fish that are very valuable, we know very little about most of these populations, and even species where, you caught this certain species, no one really knows what the impact of that is. And so, when policymakers ask us, we need more data. If you want to protect in a place like the Channel Islands, well, show us why, right? Getting data like this, having divers in the water, collecting the environmental DNA, combining that with underwater robots that are able to tell you a story in a much more complex way, all of that is really using the latest technology for this purpose of conservation.
It's kind of funny, though, that lawmakers, even though they are lawmakers, err on the side of let's not make laws, let's not do anything. I understand that they get over busy, but it's sort of funny how their default position is let's not do a thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it goes beyond just, we're busy and we've got a lot of stuff to do, right? I think that there is a feeling that somehow that they are responsible for, keeping fishermen out there on the water, right? So anytime there's some sort of new regulation that might make things more difficult, that's something that's politically difficult to do, right? So because over time, fishermen have become accustomed to being out there, being able to use a certain type of fishing technology or equipment. All of a sudden it now is, if you want to change something, you're now taking something away, even though the reality is these are public resources. They're owned by everybody, right? And we give permits out to fishermen to go out and be able to fish for certain species using certain techniques. But at some point, I think that we're realizing is some of those things are extremely damaging and ultimately undermine the resilience of our ecosystems to handle and cope with some of these changes that are happening. As a result of, climate that is now, changing the temperatures and changing the acidity of the ocean. I mean, I was actually quite blown away on this last expedition, having been a diver in the kelp forest there in the Channel Islands 20 years ago, to see how much of the kelp forest has actually been lost. These are real effects of climate change that we're seeing. And oftentimes it's sort of like a house of cards, right? You may not realize how important an individual species is. You may not really recognize the ecological role it plays in a food web. But then all of a sudden a species goes missing and the whole thing crumbles. And that's what we're trying to avoid, is we need to get out in front of that and really err on the side of precaution, so that we're not just sort of, the burden of proof isn't just on conservation. We're trying to really reverse that burden of proof so that we can, before we allow some damaging activity, we can understand the possible impacts first. And so that's really how we're trying to affect policy change. And, and even showing folks, look at how much is still there. Look at all this that we don't know about, that we're just starting to discover. That's a key piece of changing that underlying philosophy about how we think about policy in the ocean.
I have this notion about how this area might advance in the future. And I'd love your feedback after I sort of explain my thoughts here. One of the interesting things about fisheries is that unlike, say, a factory or manufacturing job, you can't just threaten, oh, if we can't do it cheaply enough here, we're going to go somewhere else. Because the resource is right there, right? You can't move the fish. So even if the industry moves, if they want to utilize that resource, they have to do it right there, subject to the regulations of that area. And I've thought of fisheries actually a lot like farmland. You have many, many countries. United States is one of them. United Kingdom is another one. Switzerland is another one, where they have said, our farmland is important to us. We not only want it farmed, but we want it done in a sustainable way that makes things look pretty. And we even subsidize the people doing that at times in order to make sure that it's sort of sustainable and done the right way so it's not overly exploitative, or that those resources don't get run down and other entities come in there that we can't regulate. And I wonder if there's analogs you can draw to the oceans, that periphery of oceans around land masses, where you have the same mindset. This is like farmland. We want it to be nice. We understand that there are resources to be had, but it's our incentive to highly regulate it as opposed to under-regulate it, because we know those industries have to work with us if they want to be there. And left to their own devices, they'll do what they've done in the past, which is overexploit to the point where they'll just move on and the environment will be barren or ruined forever or for many, many years.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of cases in fisheries, it's very difficult because even unlike farmland, right, in fisheries, there's sort of this idea where nobody owns it, right? It's a common property resource, so it's inherently, very difficult to.
But that's like a several thousand-year-old notion at this point.
Yeah, but I mean, it's still like there isn't private property, in the ocean. And so it really is, permitting fishermen to kind of be out there using certain technologies. But, and I think, while it's not just about like in the farms, I think you're kind of simplifying it to some degree, but, it's not just about looking pretty and having these like pretty, beautiful ecosystems for us to enjoy.
For sure.
It's the idea that, in a wild fishery, you still have a balance of food production for people, and you're trying to actually have an ecosystem at the same time, right? It's not just a feedlot. It's not just an aquaculture. It's not just a farm. You're actually, have a whole ecosystem and able to, as humans, be a part of that ecosystem and participate ultimately as a predator. And I think that what we've seen is, when you have that sort of more non-renewable, exploitative mining type of mindset, we call them like the roving bandits, where you just go and exploit one area, get everything you can and move on, right? If you're able to move around and there's enough ocean to do that, sure, like that might make sense. But ultimately, we have to live in these places. And these are places that are, right here in some of these, national and I'd say even international treasures of, biodiversity. So how do we balance those things? And I do think that in many cases, we have put in subsidies and assisted fishermen with transitions. I think one of the great examples that I was able to work on at Oceana was transitioning harmful drift gill nets into cleaner deep set buoy gear that is much more selective. So the gill nets, essentially are unselective. They're catching all sorts of animals as bycatch, everything from sharks they don't want to endangered sea turtles and large whales. And, Oceana and the government were able to actually help raise funds to shift that technology into a much cleaner, more selective technology for catching swordfish, and actually fund a transition program so that fishermen are able to stay on the water. We can keep these jobs at home. We're not just going to be, doing what they call the transfer effect, is we just shut things down here and then just import stuff from somewhere else. It's actually a way to support a domestic fishery. And that really gets to the heart of, I think, where Oceana's philosophy is, right? It's not just shutting down harmful activities. It's how do we find solutions so that fishermen can stay on the water? How do we kind of keep doing what we're doing, but do it in a smarter way that's much more in touch and connected to the ecosystem, so that we're sort of a part of that as a predator rather than going out there and just harming it or just taking from it.
I think that's such an important point, because it's not Oceana's prerogative to say, no, don't do anything. It's we are going to do things. We're not saying radically stop all activity. But hey, folks, multiple people need to enjoy this for the long run. Let's do this in a way that we're not shooting ourselves in the foot, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I mean, for a lot of years, and this kind of gets back to your earlier point, right? It's sort of like, well, we allow these activities and we wait until some sort of problem shows up. But if you wait for that to happen, a lot of times it's already too late, right? If you run a bottom trawl fishery, right, which is kind of like they call it a dragger, where that runs right over and can clear cut the ocean floor. And you do that in a place where you've got 1,000-year-old deep sea corals and sponges and reefs down there. You essentially have an irreversible impact. So by the time you actually discover it, it's already lost. And and now we're still have an exemption in California law where some of these set gill nets that are anchored to the bottom and catch all sorts of species migrating back and forth to and from the islands, they're all just getting entangled, and most of them have no market value and are just thrown away. The majority of them dead, and we don't really know what the effects are, and no one's really asking those questions. But if we can figure out a way to better understand what's happening in the ocean, make that case, and actually find and support cleaner ways to catch the valuable species. Halibut and white sea bass are very valuable species that are targeted in these nets. But if we can catch them without all of that other collateral impact, or that bycatch that's just wasted and thrown back without really understanding what that means, that really is the goal, is to keep the fishermen out there, keep supplying local seafood, but do it in a way that, is smarter and not going to have those impacts.
So let's talk about the interests of an organization like Blancpain. And I'll be sort of somewhat humorously cynical about this, but it sort of begins with preserving pretty places, right? Because Blancpain is amongst those watchmakers that make luxury dive watches. And part of that is people taking these watches on vacation for either just beach going or recreational diving and things like that. And it is true that when you spend a lot of money and you're a well-to-do person and you go to a tropical locale or something like that, if you see an issue in the environment, you see coral reefs deteriorating, you see a lack of species, you're like, wait a minute, this isn't the oceans I was expecting. And you start to wonder what's going on and what you can do about it. So in a sense, even though there are very important things related to us living on this planet together, it can sometimes begin with, wait a minute, this isn't as pretty as I thought. And Blancpain has a larger initiative they call Ocean Commitment, which is not one thing, but sort of a larger agenda to support various initiatives around the world. And a lot of it has to do with preserving, at the core, the fun places to take these luxury dive watches. Again, I know it's sort of a cynical look at it, but that's okay. If that leads to important changes, if that leads to support an organization that is intended to keep the waters clean and thriving as much as possible, then I think it's okay. And so sometimes there's sort of funny ways that this all gets set up, a luxury dive watch, what is the connection? But it really has to do with maintaining an attractive place to dive, which helps the larger environment. What are some of the things that the Blancpain people have said to you about what their goals are, what they'd like to see? I'm just curious what you can illustrate as sort of their mindset and some of the statements that they've made.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why, for all the reasons you said, that's why the partnership really is ideal. And I mean, in a lot of respects, the same things that make, the ocean a really pretty place to dive, like getting to go into a beautiful kelp forest with the light trickling down. I mean, like, there's nothing more magical than that. And then the idea that you could see, a 500-pound giant sea bass, right? This huge fish. I mean, this is what is, bringing a lot of people out there to go diving, right? That's why this area is such a spectacular diving destination. I mean, I think the Channel Islands probably, I would put it in terms of, California or even the U.S. West Coast. I mean, this is our premier scuba diving spot if you want to just go see awesome things and have an incredible experience. But it's those same things that, protecting the kelp forest. I mean, the kelp forest is not just beautiful, but it's the habitat. It's these structures, the corals that are so beautiful, the kelp. I mean, this is what fish are using for, what they call essential fish habitat, right? fish don't just kind of live and just swim around randomly in the ocean. They need places where they can feed, where they can get protection, where they can, lay their eggs, where the young can grow up and be protected without getting eaten. And these habitats, create those nooks and crannies and essentially like turn sort of a barren, flat area into skyscrapers that are full of all sorts of homes for marine life to live in, whether those things are commercial or recreational fish or just really awesome stuff like, octopus and sea stars and, unusual species. But I mean, we've had a detrimental impact. I mean, the giant sea bass that I told you about, I mean, these were the kings of the kelp forest, right? These are gigantic fish that essentially have no predators because they're so big. And they used to be, all over. You'd go into a kelp forest and it would be like these kings that were out there, kind of controlling and being the predators of the forest. And they were hunted to near extinction because they're such a prized fish, both commercially and recreationally. And so, they're now prohibited species where they're not allowed to be caught, but they're still caught in the gill nets, and they have an exemption that allows them to keep them and even sell them. And so trying to raise awareness about that, to help bring back this depleted species to an abundance, right? We call them, the former and future kings, right? We have this vision that we could bring back and restore this abundant kelp forest. If we're able to do that, it's going to make our ecosystems more resilient. It's going to be better for fishing and food production types of opportunities. And it's going to make these spots even more awesome to go take your fancy Blancpain watch to go diving in, right? And so that's the natural nexus. And I think, talking about specific species and stories like that, where our work could actually make a difference to protect these habitats that are important for the fish and these sensitive species that, many of them are depleted, we can bring those back to abundance. I mean, that's what I think when we've talked with the Blancpain folks, that's really what gets them excited. It's about the link between conservation and then making these places, awesome dive sites as well.
I want to talk about the 50 Fathoms watch collection for a moment. I don't know if you had a lot of experience diving with mechanical watches prior to wearing your 50 Fathoms. But as you probably know, there is a large assortment of high-end dive watches on the market, but most people don't necessarily think what is actually useful underwater diving. On a very basic level, what is your review of the Blancpain as a diving watch companion?
Yeah, I mean, basically, one of the most important things that you have to do is when you're underwater is know how long you've been there and be able to see something that otherwise might be very dark, and actually be able to know how long you're down there, right? In terms of how long is the dive for safety. You have to be able to know that for your air. You got to be doing that, checking depending on what depth you are. You need to know when it's time to come back up. And so we had very strict safety protocols that we had to follow, but you basically get down there and you turn the bezel so you can start the beginning of your dive and actually be able to see that. And so I mean, it was actually fun for me. I've mostly been working with a computer that would show you that stuff, but right. The first thing is to actually check out the watch, see where I am. It's sort of like the kind of classic OG way of doing it, right? Like that was how divers the key tool for divers underwater. So to be able to do that and then supplement it with the dive computer, I mean, it was fantastic. And I mean, it's great to have something where that you're not going to be, in a situation where it's not going to function or it's going to break down there. I mean, it's, it definitely gives you that extra level of confidence and knowing that you're kind of part of that long-standing tradition of, this company that has been making these things since really scuba diving started.
I think what's so interesting is that you indeed wear the watches. When I was there, maybe it was just for picture purposes, but I don't think it was. I think when you go down underwater now, you are wearing, like you said, your dive computer on one wrist and your mechanical 50 Fathoms on the other. And yes, this is a luxury timepiece, but what impressed me so much about the 50 Fathoms is that it maintains its status as a good diving instrument tool. Before it's a luxury item, it is a good tool. It's very legible. It makes a huge amount of sense. Yes, it's very classic in its design, but I really like that Blancpain has never abandoned the utilitarian tool side of this product when trying to promote it as a luxury item. And that's one of the things that again, I'm a dive watch lover. Like Geoff, you don't necessarily know this, but I love dive watches. I own many, many dive watches, but not all of them are actually good for diving, right? That this one is, but is also pretty, is great. And when I see Geoff and his team wearing these, I know that a little bit about it is emotion and ego. Not in a bad way, but you're like, wearing this makes me feel better. Or I think I look a little bit cooler, which adds a nice little layer on top of the professional thing you're doing, because it gives you a boost when it comes to energy, morale, enthusiasm, in what is otherwise sort of a data collection, but you're making it a fun experience. And in a very direct way, the watches help make it more fun, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. We had an assortment that we were able to use out there. And I mean, each of the divers, I mean, whether we're taking photos to get pretty photos with the watch or not, like we all wanted to wear the watch. Like I just started wearing it all the time. I wanted to wear it every time I got in the water. So yeah, and I think it's also just the pride in the partnership, right? I mean, to know that there's a company out there that's really believing in what we're doing and investing in that, that's something that makes me proud to be a partner and to be able to kind of do that. We also had their logo on our wetsuits and on a lot of our equipment. I mean, it was something that I think we wanted to show with pride, because I mean that partnership and the ability to do what we're doing, I think wouldn't have been possible without Blancpain and their just strong support for actually doing science that contributes to conservation directly.
Well, this is what I've talked about in the past, where a wristwatch is also a trophy. And wearing it, I think for you, is recognizing that a company like Blancpain has looked at what you do and said that they are worth supporting, rewarding. And that's got to feel very, very good, that some other third party validates and encourages you. I would wear that as a badge of honor, no problem. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think, it makes us all proud knowing, that there is a company out there that has the credibility, that's been around the dive community, that has, I think, a following of people that really care about these things and care about this nexus. And I think that it does feel good all around. And, and the ability to put an expedition together, in a 6-month period and pull it off and do it safely and be getting some of this world-class data, out there and pushing the boundaries of technology and using it in new ways. I mean, to me, that sort of is the spirit of what the partnership's all about.
Now, I want you to answer a question for the smaller watch brands out there. There are, as we know, many different watch companies out there. They're not all as well resourced as a Blancpain. If there's a smaller watch company that genuinely wants to assist in ocean conservation, doesn't want to just sort of pay lip service, actually wants to do something, what are some types of recommendations you would have for other lifestyle companies, watchmakers and other ones that truly want to participate? What are some of the more meaningful ways they can do to support organizations like Oceana and others that are actually doing good, credible work?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly, obviously, kind of step one is kind of doing the research, finding groups out there that actually are getting out there and making real change, right? I mean,
any telltale signs of like how to recognize a credible from a sort of marketing style one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for us, there's sort of a difference between saying, well, here's what I'm working on, right? I'm working on this problem or that problem versus like what's actually been accomplished, right? Are there measurable, objective, goals that an organization has that they can report back and have the credibility on? I mean, sometimes, in the policy world, it's not, you don't bat 1,000, right? It's difficult, right? Sometimes you lose and you have to hold yourself accountable to those things and learn from them and come back and try again. And I think that being honest about that and where you were able to be successful and what specifically, happened versus when you weren't able to be successful, I think those are all kind of really critical in doing that research in terms of kind of finding an organization. And I think there are different tools too, and different ones align differently. Some organizations are kind of much more kind of gung-ho, hardcore, wanting to fight. Other ones, I think, are, much more collaborative and want to kind of work on, finding solutions and kind of funding. I think Oceana is kind of an interesting one because we're kind of in the middle. We straddle both of those. We're able to, we realize that to find solutions, you can't just be friends with everyone all the time. You do have to engage in conflict and actually be able to fight and be able to have lawyers and be able to use the force of the law to be able to get where you want to go. But at the same time, you want to be able to be solution oriented. So, finding solutions, not just kind of talking about problems you're working on, and demonstrating what specifically you were able to do to change something that, a lot of times there's a tendency to say something happened and everyone sort of says, oh, well, I kind of wanted to take credit for that. But how did you actually go about doing that? And I think there's all sorts of different ways from just getting the word out to folks. I mean, through various channels, right? It's a large part of the challenge in this world is getting the public to even know what's at stake, right? The fact that we even have these amazing ocean treasures right off the coast. I mean, I think very few people, have actually even been out to the Channel Islands, right? So, and not that everyone needs to go there, but at least be aware that you've got this, national treasure right out there. How do you get the word out to people, through various, different venues? And I think different watch companies, on the smaller side, do have a role to play, and just that general public awareness about what's out there, get people excited about that, and really to help fall in love with some of these places. And finding groups that really have a match in terms of their philosophy and approach. I mean, I think there are lots of different ways to go about it, but, getting the word out and really being able to directly support so that these groups can actually get out there and do what they do best. I mean, that ultimately there's probably a gazillion ways to do that. But I think that's really the pathway.
Here's some of the larger context of why I brought that up, and thank you for the response. We live in a society where we have a lot of consumers being asked to do what I call consumer activism. Help solve the world's problems through your spending, right? Buy from this company and they will take some of your money to do X or Y. This has become such a popular notion that I think it's being exploited so easily, and consumers are being wary, where they recognize that every company has some type of feel-good, earth-loving, sustainability, whatever you want to call it, message, that consumers are recognizing there's no way that all of these companies are actually contributing. And there's a lot of situations that are actually quite bad. There's all these ocean plastics which are being collected and ropes and nets and things like that are turned into watch cases and straps and things like that. And I think what people don't understand is at the end of the day, even though it's great that you're trying to repurpose trash, it costs more energy to make straps out of those material than virgin plastic, so to say. And I think that consumers are starting to be wary, whereas there is a good message underlying all this. There is good work that's being done. I worry that both consumers and the organizations asked to support these initiatives are going to become, again, skeptical and cynical and not do as much as they might because they don't know that it's actually going anywhere. And so I want consumers to recognize that even through all the noise, there are very, very dedicated people like Geoff and his team, like Oceana and others, who use this money to do things you want them to do. But of course, it's hard as a consumer to know which situation to take seriously because it's so easy from a marketing standpoint to be like, feel bad about the world. Well, if you buy this, you'll feel a little bit better because that's essentially what they're selling, right?
Yeah, I mean, we call that greenwashing, and I think that because those sort of claims have proliferated, right? And marketing companies realize, oh, people will pay more, or that'll help us get a market edge. Let's sort of try to do the cheaper, low cost version of that without really doing anything. But, people won't know the difference anyway. And I think that's really where the need for some sort of legitimacy check comes in, right? It's how do you see through those claims? Because those claims are out there. It's something that worries me a lot, right? And a lot of times what happens is, it's governments or companies that are sort of making these self-proclamations, right? That you can't really verify in any way. They just sort of tell you it's going to be, good for this or that. But I mean, I think that the important point is that there are actually behind a lot of these, as you said, there are good folks out there that are really actually using this and really taking it seriously, right? I mean, I don't want to waste any of the funds, right? I want to make sure that we are out there and that we're as successful as possible. And, we work hard every day. I mean, we're out there on the water trying to really make sure that we get the best possible images, that our data is solid and bulletproof. I mean, it is a tremendous amount of work to make sure you're doing the science, and and the policy process is equally challenging, right? And I think just being able to see what is really behind it, kind of take a closer look. Is this just something that is an unverifiable claim that's just being put out there by the company you're buying from, versus is there an organization behind it? I mean, you can go on our website and learn about us and see how different charity evaluators look at us. There's different ways you can kind of compare different groups to kind of see who's actually doing work that you care about that's making a real difference. So I think it is important when you have those sort of claims out there to look a little bit deeper and to really see is there a partnership with an organization, right? And is that organization actually doing work? And you're in being able to look a little bit deeper than just that sort of trust all the marketing, I think is that critical step consumers can take.
It's a bit hard, but every answer goes back to, hey, consumer, you have to do your research. Don't believe things at face value. You need to dig a little bit and make the determination if it all feels real, which is really the best that we can say about any of this, is that you have to become informed before you then make decisions.
Yeah, I think exactly. It's, ask questions about it. Like, in the seafood realm that I work in, right? I mean, you can imagine every place that you might buy seafood, they all want to make a claim that their seafood is sustainable, right? And so it's like, well, so how do you even know? Like, sustainable seafood, it's just like, well, that's just what seafood is now. Everything says they're sustainable. But, is that is it coming from a government? Is it coming from, just the company or that's selling it to you? There's a group called Seafood Watch that's part of the Monterey Bay Aquarium, one of their programs, and they go out there and they have scientists that don't have a dog in the fight. They don't have a conflict of interest. They're going out there and independently evaluating seafood from all over the world, and that's a place where I trust the information that's coming. And in order to use their recommendations, you have to ask some questions about where your seafood comes from. What species is it? Is it farmed or is it wild? What kind of technique was used? What species is it? All those things are critical questions that if you can kind of do some basic research and ask some of those things, I think that's really how you can become a responsible consumer and actually be making positive change with your dollars, which I think is an important real thing if you can do it responsibly.
Let's talk about you for a moment, because I've noticed that you have a very interesting set of skills. You're a scientist, you're a speaker, you're sort of a connector and a leader. Where, you mentioned, of course, your study at Stanford, but talk a little bit more about the formation of this professional role that you've established. And again, I can totally see has various different types of educational paths that got to where you are.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely followed a lot of different interests as I kind of went through my educational career. I think starting out really with a passion and a love for the natural world. Spent a lot of time traveling and just becoming fascinated with life on Earth, from tropical rainforests in Costa Rica to going diving at the Great Barrier Reef. Right, like I just fell in love with it, and naturally kind of got into the world of biology, but very soon realize that, biology alone and just doing science and publishing papers and going to conferences, that's not enough. And that we need to really think about bringing in other tools to solve some of these problems, right? So I think what I see myself is someone who not only knows kind of a lot of different disciplines, but knows how to kind of put different pieces together, right? So it's interdisciplinary, not just multidisciplinary. Interestingly, you can use a lot of the same tools in ecology that you use in economics. And you can kind of, I got into the kind of study of how you integrate these natural systems with the social system. And as you said before, a lot of this is just basically being able to speak and educate others about some of some of these things. So, with all these, you can probably tell I'm very, passionate and feel strongly about this work. And that I think is a good starting place for anybody. Start with what you're passionate about and have that drive you. But, being able to go out there and teach school kids as well as, teach decision makers and members of Congress and legislators, right? It's really not too different of a skill set, right? It's being able to try to communicate these things and take things that are very complex and try to explain them in a way that pretty much, anybody could understand. So, I started out more on the biology side, but really realized there's a whole lot more experiences to have. And as I got into the world of fishing, I realized I needed to get out there and go on fishing boats. So I lived in fishing communities, lived with families. We went out there with fishermen day after day to live the lifestyle, to really experience it for myself. And I think because I have that background experience, it enabled me to, I think, talk to a wider set of folks and to be able to use different languages and to really be able to kind of understand these things in a way that you can't just get from studying things in school.
I'd love for you to build on that and discuss your particular approach to acting as a liaison between what I call scientists and lay people. This is sort of a frequent issue, especially in policymaking, where you have the scientific community who seems sometimes desperate to convey some type of information that the lay community isn't ready to accept, doesn't understand. Of course, we had a lot of this experience several years ago with COVID-19 and various types of recommendations, but there seems to be only a select amount of people like yourself that can bridge these two communities together. What are some of your strategies and tricks to create dialogues and open pathways of discussion between those science-minded individuals, and we'll just sort of, for purpose of this conversation, we'll call them lay people?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, as a scientist, the tendency is to get into more and more detail, right? And to get into the nitty gritty and the nuances. And there's all sorts of those, caveats and all these things to be aware of as a good scientist when you're speaking with other scientists. But, it's kind of like, can you describe what you're doing at your dinner table at Thanksgiving to your family, to your grandmother, to your children, right? These are the sort of skills that I think are really important, and it's all about distilling what's really the important take-home message, and how do you take some sort of very complicated thing like environmental DNA or doing these scuba diving transects and translate them into something that that people can understand. And so I think that's trying to connect it with things people would understand in their own day-to-day lives and and things that people can imagine, and using visuals I think is a really important thing. Like we spent a lot of time when we were at sea not just getting data, but also getting really compelling visual images so that we could show people exactly what it looks like. A picture speaks 1,000 words, and trying to just kind of break down the fundamental kind of essence of some of the science that we're doing and really explain like what it's for, right? We're doing this because we're trying to create policy change. And so what are the elements of that are compelling, right? You've got an amazing treasure. You have biodiversity. You've got something that's sensitive, that's harmed by human activity. And then how do you connect that to something that people are doing that people could potentially change and get involved in? I mean, that is, it's not something that you can pick up right away, but it is kind of a natural skill and getting back to, ancient humans, right? Being able to tell a story.
Yeah. I mean, I actually want to put the responsibility on the scientists. Not that they're fault, but the scientists, I'm interested in science. I've studied a lot. Often speak assuming that people know what they're talking about, and they forget how little a layperson knows about what they do, both in practice and in context. And their inability to say why we're doing this, or here's what to take away from it, comes from the fact that scientists are told to say, never come to any conclusions. Say, it looks like this is happening. This is probably happening. But the layperson needs more conclusiveness in statements. This is why we're doing it. This is what the findings mean. And scientists are sort of trained not to talk that way. And so I think scientists need to create more relatability and creating context of what we think is generally happening, never with 100% precision, but understanding that most colloquial conversation, errs on 80, 90% assurance that you think it's right. And I think that that's often where the issue is there's there's a necessary obsession with the details, but being able to look at it a little bit more on a macro perspective of how someone else might view this. It's like if you just saw a scientist doing 2% of what they would do, you'd have no idea what it is unless you understood that other 98%, sort of like the DNA in the water, right? If you just look at that, if you really know what to look at in that data, you can extrapolate more. But if you're just a layperson seeing that data, it would mean nothing to you. The other 98% would just be foreign. And so scientists, I think, need to build a more detailed picture about what they're doing and what it looks like to create some of that. And I don't know if it's culture, sometimes impatience, a little bit of his ego, but what do you think are some of the things that you can impart upon a scientist to be a little bit more patient and understand there's so much to gain just by being a little bit less of a scientist when you come to communicating?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you said, the difficulty is that scientists are trained to talk to other scientists, right? To maintain their credibility, and to speak at a scientific conference, right? They're not trained to be able to explain something to an 8-year-old. And I think that in a large part, a lot of, I have seen a shift in that whole idea of science communication is becoming this sort of new up and coming field where scientists are realizing they need to do a better job at that, so that they, their job is to not just talk to the 5 or 6 other people that have gone all the way down that scientific road and can talk about all those details, right? It's the importance of, talking to other folks that don't have that education, that haven't gone down and taken all those classes and that aren't already there at that same level. And it's great to be able to communicate with scientists that have been there and get all into the details of the primers and the DNA and all the different techniques you might be using and all the statistics. But, the critical piece is, it's like, why are we doing this? It's we have a love for the ocean. We want to tell that story and get that word out to as many folks as we can. And ultimately, when you're trying to convince policymakers, they don't have time for, to listen, to read your scientific paper and to go to a conference, for a week. You need to be able to convince them in a matter of a few minutes. So, you've got to kind of try to figure out what are the key values, what is going to be the most compelling things, and really ask yourself, because we forget to do this, why are you doing this work? And that was the first question you asked. Why do an expedition, right? Well, we're trying to save some of these places that are currently at threat. And so how does the science do that?
We're almost out of time, but I just wanted to mention one thing on that point, that this is why I'm so zealous about this topic. When I was in law school, I remember reading a book. I forgot exactly what it was called, but basically it came up with this term called plain English. It was basically writing, legalese, but in plain English. And you recognize that so much legal language is literally written to be confusing. It's lawyers writing for other lawyers. The average person, even if they could theoretically understand the concept, would not be able to understand it by reading it. And there was this big push to do legal writing in plain English. And it was so impressed upon me when I understood this, that I saw the difference between writing for a layperson in legalese versus plain. And you could do the same thing in plain English. And I think scientists need to think the same way. Yes, you're going to have a lot of jargon, terminology, concepts that are only going to make sense to other scientists. But writing it in plain English is the most powerful thing you can do to let other people know what you're doing. Because ultimately, the science is for everyone. It's not just for scientists. Just like the law is not just for lawyers. It's for everyone. And that, for me, impressed upon me this idea of it's okay to do things in plain English. Because if you don't think about that, you enter the field and all you see is other people writing and speaking in jargon, and you think that's what's expected of you. You don't necessarily realize that's actually a bad thing and not necessarily a good thing, right?
Yeah, I think there is the false perception out there that if you want to be recognized as, a credible scientist, you have to speak in jargon and you have to use and show off all your big words and all these things that you learned and impart all this knowledge that you've accumulated to that sort of high, graduate school, university level. But we even take we've taken these courses of just like take this really complicated sentence and like see how few words you could say the same thing in, right? the simplest words as possible. And then you do that and you read it and it actually helps change the way you think. It helps the way you speak and you write. by, realizing, you can say the same thing in a compelling way, and you don't need to go convince the world that you're the top of your field, the top of your scientists. Maybe when you're at a conference, you might need to impress people that way. But I think if you want to, engage people in what you're doing, and, it's like we all have, I think a basic connection to the natural world. And I think, and the thing about the ocean that makes my job easy is that people have a fascination with the ocean, right? And so, building on that and helping teach people some basic things from wherever their starting point is, that to me is a win, to get people more excited about the ocean. Hey, I didn't know that. I mean, that's why I still love doing this work. I'm still learning things about the ocean, that I didn't know. I still see things going out there that I've never seen before. So to bring that fascination to other people and to share that in a way that really connects humans to humans, I mean, that to me is really the first step. And that's really critical in getting the messages across that ultimately then, we need people caring about the ocean, and constituents out there to these lawmakers to get the lawmakers to change. They're not just going to take some scientist's word for it. They need to know that people actually care. And so realizing that and seeing how powerful that is, that's really motivated me to try to speak in a different way and to engage a much broader audience.
What a great conversation about Blancpain-sponsored Oceana. Geoff, please tell people where they can learn more about yourself as well as Oceana on the internet.
Yeah, best place is to go to our website, www.oceana.org. You can find out all about our expedition. You can see the videos and the 360 camera footage from the expedition we were just at in the kelp forest, and actually experience it yourself. So check out oceana.org when you get a chance.
This has been the Superlative Podcast interview with Dr. Geoff Shester of Oceana. Geoff, thank you so much.
It's been great. Thank you, Ariel.